I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Hotel Mars, off to the moon. The mystery of moon dust. There was a moment waiting for Apollo 11, looking for the supreme moment of the Cold War. The victory over the Soviet creature suddenly sounds relevant, doesn't it? In the 20th century, the Apollo 11 crew taking the lander down, landing it safely, firmly. There was always the fear that it would sink into the moon dust, that those three tripods that were out there would rumble to the side and the craft would tip over, and therefore it'd be impossible to ever leave the surface of the moon. There was the possibility that even if they could certify that this particular part of the moon was solid enough to land on, that this one that you chose as Armstrong maneuvered the craft in those last moments would be a pool, like quicksand in the old Ramar of the Jungle episode. Always quicksand was the fear. Well, once they landed, there was always the moment to fear that when they went down to the surface of the moon and stepped on it, they'd sink, they'd tumble over. Hence, the mystery of the moon dust continues. The moon dust dates back to the Apollo program, and I welcome my colleague and co-host, David Livingston, Dr. Space of the Space Show. David, have you got any moon dust mysteries sitting around in your studio tonight? Good evening to you, David.
Good evening, John. No, and I guess it'd be against the law to actually have any moon dust unless you got something off of some piece that went up for auction.
You mean you wouldn't admit to it if you had it? Is that what I mean? I tried to trick you there. It didn't work. You caught me on it. We welcome Professor Haym Benaroya, Professor of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering at Rutgers University. I'm not going to ask you, Professor, if you have any moon dust. What I'm going to ask you is to help the audience understand LADEE, this mission that is now sentenced to end violently. LADEE will plow, crash, drive into the moon, we believe April 21st. Why did NASA launch LADEE? What did LADEE hope to do about the mystery of the moon dust? Good evening to you, Haym.
Good evening, John. It's a pleasure to be here. LADEE was basically, it stands for Lunar Atmosphere and Dust Environment Explorer. So there are really two legs to this mission. The first one is just the science of the dust, the physical processes where various elements migrate across the lunar surface. In fact, this is how they think water molecules accumulated in the polar cold traps. So they wanted to see some evidence of that by characterizing the surface. The other was really for exploration. If we are going to go back to the moon, which I hope we do, of course, with people and robots and machines and build structures there, then we need to understand the effect of that dust on humans, because we know that, for example, the dust is toxic to human respiratory system. It can affect the eyes and the skin, and it's damaging also to electronics and machines and everything we put up there. And that's our history from Apollo, and we're trying to figure out if what we think happens actually does happen.
David?
Good evening, Haym. They had a lunar dust experiment to carry out on LADEE. Tell us about it and what happened.
Well, what they were trying to do is to find out whether the effect which they think happens at the terminator between daytime and nighttime, where there's the positive charge and the negative charges meet, they think that electrical forces would levitate this charged dust high off the lunar surface. This was something that was seen during Apollo, and they wanted to go back and figure out the details of that. It seems that they haven't found that yet. However, there's the hope that in the next week, as they orbit closer and closer to the surface, that they may be able to observe it and take some measurements with the spectrometers they have on board.
Haym, why are they crashing LADEE into the moon? What do they hope to accomplish?
Well, I think they only have a certain amount of fuel, and they're going to crash it on the far side because they're worried that they don't want to crash into any of the sites where we have landed rockets. So the moon has a very erratic gravitational field, so they don't feel that they can be that precise by targeting it on the front side of the moon. So they're going to target it to the back side of the moon.
And the crash, for example, we've had a NASA probe and a Japanese probe. They hope to produce information by bumping, crashing, driving, blowing into an asteroid or a comet. Is there similar information we can gather in this impact?
It's unclear. All the seismometers that were left from Apollo have long since lapsed. They may be able to get some information, but I don't think that's the main thrust of crashing it. They just need to get rid of it in a safe spot.
David?
Haym, last week we read that Russia is talking about returning to the moon to stay and making it part of their deep space exploration program. We know China is there. We've done some really great science missions to the moon, but we don't hear anything about us going back with humans to stay. What are we missing that others seem to understand or grasp or think about?
Well, it seems that at the highest political levels, the decision has been made that, and I think primarily to save money, to basically find other activities for NASA. Even though we still do science and we're still developing rockets and we're sending rovers and all these great exploration vehicles, there's basically the decision has been made that the earlier Bush vision of sending people back to the moon and this time to stay is not part of that track. And even within NASA, there's really a sort of a dichotomy. Some people still are seeing the moon as seeing the moon as the path to Mars, and others don't see the moon as part of that path. I think, David, you and I certainly believe that the moon is the best place to start understanding, how to civilize the solar system. One more point I want to make is all this stuff about dust on the moon and how toxic it is. Mars has a similar toxic dust problem. It's just different elements, but the essence, as far as the survivability of people and machines and electronics, is essentially the same kind of problem. So the moon still is the place to go to understand all these various issues that we need in order to survive there.
Haym Benaroya is the author of a transporting book about the moon and Mars. It's entitled Turning Dust to Gold, Building a Future on the Moon and Mars. It's available on Amazon. You can get it now. You can read the reviews. They are rosy about how Haym has presented the case for colonies on the moon and colonies on Mars. And by analogy, Haym, David is correct about the Chinese and Russian ambitions for the surface of the moon. The engineering, if I recall your book correctly, we spoke about it a few years ago, and I'm very happy to recall it. The engineering is in place. What we need to do, we already have in the labs. There's no extra component. It's not even just money. It's the will to gather all of these forces. We could certainly put together a coalition of the willing to colonize the moon. Have I said that too aggressively, Haym, or is that accurate?
I think a lot of the engineering is available, and what isn't available is most likely solvable. There's also the biological end of it, the survival of people. That's actually a little bit more difficult, and many believe that we really need to go to the moon in order to solve some of these problems. Some of the engineering and biological problems really need the lunar laboratory for analysis and solution. And
lunar laboratory, we're talking about sublunar colonies, right? We live underneath the surface. We have to be shielded from random events on the surface of the moon. And we're building a unit under there, not unlike the ISS or how they live in Antarctica. That's what we're doing.
That's true. The units that we have in space, these circular cylindrical structures, are the kind that we will first put on the surface, and eventually the goal would be to have them mostly underground for the reasons you said, basically to shield us against radiation, against micrometeorites, and be able to survive for very long terms.
David?
Haym, do you see this changing anytime soon? Is this an issue of the American people waking up to the value and importance of the moon, or is it strictly in the hands of leadership?
I think it's sort of both. Both have to be on board, but it definitely takes leadership to make the case, just as Kennedy made the case. I think a very strong leader at the top can make the point to the American people that going to the moon is not just another special interest group. Going to the moon is all Americans' special interest. We all will benefit from that kind of activity.
Haym Benaroya, professor at Rutgers University. He is the author, most importantly, of Turning Dust to Gold, building a future on the moon and Mars. David, you're ready to go and live on a moon colony. You don't care about the risk, correct?
Well, I'd certainly go and visit a lunar colony, and I'd like to do that more than once. Absolutely.
There are young people, David, listening to us right now who will make that trip, and I envy them. David Livingston, Dr. Space of the Space Show. This is Hotel Mars Episode N.